Thank you all for coming. The Belt and Road Initiative that Dorothy is leading is truly an interdisciplinary program, because you can imagine this is an initiative that touches upon politics, economics, and all other aspects that the university should be involved with, including history, anthropology, sociology. So please look out for more events. Dorothy is leading us to the next stage in March with another big program following the success of our program in March. Today's event started in the morning at the Miller Center with just a wonderful audience and set of questions. We're very delighted to bring two speakers to the first session and two wonderful speakers to the second session on the economics of the Belt and Road. I will not introduce the second panel until you've had a little bit to drink and eat after the break from two excellent speakers. But let me introduce the politics speakers. Mr. Doshi, who is here with us. We're very lucky to have him because he has traveled tirelessly the last few months. I met him in Taipei, and I think since I saw him in Taipei in April, he hasn't been home. And so we're very lucky to actually see him here in person. But Rush is the director of Brookings China Strategy Initiative and leads several efforts actually under the umbrella of different institutions, including the Yale Law School's China Center in looking at China's grand strategy and the Indo-Pacific security issues. Now, in this effort, he leads research on Mandarin language open sources, analysis, and Chinese behavior to understand the evolving military, economic, political, and informational components of Chinese grand strategy. I'm sure you will have many, many questions for him, but the implications of growing Chinese influence goes far and beyond what we can imagine. And Rush has written extensively, both in all aspects, the financial architecture of China, of Beijing as the center, and the military aspect, and most importantly, we will look at the economic aspect of Belt and Road today. But I want to say that Rush actually has also lived in China as a Fulbright scholar, right? And he has his PhD from my alma mater, Harvard, and he shared something with the next speaker. The comment is both of them went to Princeton for their undergrad. So let me then come to the next speaker, who's actually very hard to introduce. I actually wanted to bring sheet notes, but it's a little bit embarrassing because he's actually my husband. But it's very hard to summarize everything he has done. But I would just say thank you for your patience as we substituted somebody I'm sure we were looking forward to seeing, but Catherine Kaufman actually had to go to Rwanda. And actually underscores how thinly staffed we are at OPIC. Because the last 2 days we've been trying to find a substitute in the institution, but we have a wonderful speaker who actually spent this morning speaking to OPIC and understanding the remarks that we have delivered. Marty has his PhD from Stanford University and had been the founding dean of our Latin School of Leadership and Public Policy. Previous to that, he was the dean at the George Washington University's Eliot School. I can't even do this properly. But he has written several books that are very important in U.S.-China relations, including Organizing China, which looks at the Chinese Communist Party, and also A Fragile Relationship, U.S.-China relations since 1992, a term that he coined. So we will start off with Rush talking about the Belt and Road Initiative as part of Chinese, I would say, grand strategy, although when we printed the Chinese policy, and Harry will look at the American response, which is also of equal importance to us here. Thank you very much.
Can everybody hear me okay? Is microphone working? Okay, great. So thanks so much, all of you, for coming. Thanks, Shirley, for that very kind introduction. It's great to be able to talk with you about Belt and Road, and I think you want me to speak for about 25 minutes? Okay, great. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of the Belt and Road, and then I'll move on to some of the obstacles that the Belt and Road is facing, as well as some of the resilience that we see in the Belt and Road, before finishing with some questions about what that means for US policy. So the Belt and Road was first announced in 2013 in Kazakhstan and in Indonesia. That's basically when the project came into public consciousness. And it was termed by President Xi, of course, as the project of the century. With respect to scale, we know that it claims to be allocating about $1 trillion, although in reality, only about a $300 billion amount has been dispersed so far. And it's supposed to apply to not only countries within the Indo-Pacific and within Asia, but increasingly it's supposed to apply globally. So that's more than 100 countries total. That's its possible scale. So what is it really about? Why has China launched this massive effort that spans much of the world and costs it so much money? And so there are a few conventional explanations, and they're all to a degree correct and all to a degree incorrect. The first one is, all right, maybe this is about economics. That essentially that China is trying to find a way to use the Belt and Road to export some of its surplus capacity. It has way too much it makes in steel or in concrete and other industries. And it used that surplus initially to build itself up, but now that it's increasingly developed, it still has that manufacturing capacity. It doesn't want to use it domestically, so it's got to export it and go abroad and essentially find other people who can benefit from it for a price, of course. So this is one theory. Another part of this economic explanation is that China wants to use the Belt and Road to connect parts of its own country to other economies around the world. So think of Western China, not historically the most, not the engine of the Chinese economy, but particularly connected to Central Asia, and perhaps to the Belt and Road, even better connected in a way that would allow it to grow faster, or perhaps through a rail line that would allow Western China and goods from that part of China to reach all the way to Europe, right? So that's the economic explanation. The problem with the economic explanation, and I think we'll hear more of this subsequently, is that it doesn't quite explain everything, right? Many of the projects that China has invested in are loss-making. They don't make any money, they won't make any money. They are completely loss-making. Even if you write the costs off, you could say, well, the project will help create more trade, it'll help create more interaction that will produce overall economic benefits. But the reality is there again, that in many cases, that increased connectivity is not going to provide increased economic value. So, for example, the rail lines that will connect China all the way to Europe, as we heard this morning, those are considerably more expensive than shipping goods by sea. So, okay, so maybe economics doesn't explain everything. But what about the surplus capacity argument? Even if you were to take every Belt and Road project and every single one were funded fully, it wouldn't really absorb all of China's surplus capacity. That's how much extra capacity China produces in steel. And some of my colleagues at Brookings have run the numbers and found there's just no way you can export all the surplus. So maybe economics doesn't explain everything. So if economics doesn't explain all of the Belt and Road, what do we have left to look at? And there you can look at the question of status. Maybe status explains the Belt and Road. And here the idea is that the Belt and Road is about President Xi finding a way to burnish his profile, make himself seem really effective, and he's even written the project into the Constitution of China. So clearly maybe it's about his status. But this view doesn't work entirely either, because many of the Belt and Road projects, especially the ones that we see in the Indian Ocean, which are the most high profile, and the ones in Southeast Asia were launched years before President Xi was even President Xi. They were launched under his predecessor. So maybe it's not all about his status after all. Then some folks talk about how maybe this is about hype, right? This Belt and Road wasn't even really supposed to be anything. It was just mentioned in a speech. Chinese domestic media picked it up and amplified it. So now they were locked in with the domestic audience. Then international media picked it up and amplified it. So they felt locked in with the international audience. And the result was that this coherence was given to what was really just a rhetorical term that described stuff that China was already doing. It was just an artifact of media hype. Again, though, the hype might be media constructed, but the infrastructure is very real. There is significant disbursement. It has increased. There's real projects happening. So maybe it's not all about hype. So if it's not entirely about economics, if it's not entirely about status, and if it's not entirely a product of media hype, then what is it really about? And that's where, to answer Shirley's question, and I kind of see this as a larger part of Chinese grand strategy, that it has a lot of strategic motivations that are clear not only in the behavior that you observe, which has no better explanation than strategy and security in many cases, but not all, but also from the texts that you read, which actually explain why China is doing what it's going to do. So I didn't get to go into greater detail on the evidence this morning, but I'm hoping to do some of that now and kind of make the case concretely. So that is an overview of the Belt and Road. With that said, let me lead into the first topic I want to cover, which is the history. Then I'll go into the failures of the project, again, resilience, and how it's been adapted, fourth and finally. So first, the history. So the idea of Belt and Road was not something dating back to President Xi. It actually is much older. The idea of interoperable infrastructure around China dates back to at least President Hu Jintao, and a policy he called the going out policy, which was a policy designed to make sure that Chinese companies went global in a way that would allow them to help secure the commodities that China needed to propel its economic modernization in that decade and for decades to come. So they did this, right? This going out policy happened, and it continued to go on for a while. And as it did, it created something. It didn't just create markets, it didn't just create resource flows, it created vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities of people, 1 million overseas Chinese perhaps in Africa. Vulnerabilities of resources. The resources that flow from the Gulf and Africa to China are essential for the Chinese economy, but they all flow right past India and the Indian Ocean. And the result is some degree of vulnerability. What if somebody interferes with those lines that those resources flow along, especially if the US decides it wants to mess with China because of a conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea? There's a vulnerability there. So what do we see in Chinese sources? We see in 2003, President Hu gives a speech where he mentions for the first time the phrase Malacca dilemma. And for those of you who know your geography, you know that Malacca is a strait, and that strait is a strait that has mattered not just in this century and the last century, but actually for like 1,000 years, it turns out. And almost all Indian Ocean trade has at some point had to transit near or through the Malacca Strait. And actually, I'll give a fun story about this. If you go back to Indian history and Indonesian history and Malaysian history, there was an empire called the Srivijaya Empire, and it occupied the Malacca Strait. And it wanted to get money off that occupation. So back then, a lot of folks were Buddhists, and sandalwood was a particularly important commodity. And so the Srivijaya Empire would block people from exporting their sandalwood through the strait. They would expropriate it, or they'd purchase it, and they'd say, all right, I'll sell it myself. And they'd capture the rent, they'd capture the surplus of value. And that was like about 800 years ago. Right? So this strait has always mattered. And in the Second World War, the Japanese actually were so concerned about the Malacca Strait that they thought that they should build their own canal across Thailand's Isthmus of Kra. And that idea, by the way, wasn't a uniquely Japanese idea. Even if you go back to the Srivijaya period, when people didn't like having to pay tariffs to that empire, they went up to Thailand and they carried their goods across the land. So historically, the geography of this region has always mattered, and that's why Belt and Road matters. And that's why in 2003, President Hu gave a speech about the Malacca dilemma. So 2003, that continues. We see new discourse in China's military and economic writing about, quote, overseas interests, or Haiwai Liyi. And this concept becomes stressed in a lot of these documents. And that leads by 2009 to a speech, a very important speech that President Hu gives, where he mentions the idea of Belt and Road. An idea we associate with President Xi, but again, that President Hu, his predecessor, mentioned. And what did he say? He said that China needed to construct a network of interoperable infrastructure around it that would tie other countries to China and make China more successful economically in projecting its influence, but also in being able to secure its resources. He didn't spell everything out in that speech, but he did make very clear that he wanted to create a network of interoperable infrastructure. And in that same year, China announces the idea for the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Not publicly, this is a private announcement. This is done by the Central Party Research Office, one of the key think tanks within the Chinese Communist Party. And there, the enterprising official that comes with this idea presents it at some regional forums. Nobody really notices. They continue to tinker with the idea for a while. And in 2012, when President Hu is passing the baton to President Xi, the idea for this bank is apparently approved at that Congress, that party Congress. This is all hard to penetrate. We're not 100% sure about any of these dates or any of these specifics, but that is what the evidence seems to point at. So again, this bank, which was designed to help capitalize and finance the Belt and Road, was pursued as early as 2012, again, before the Belt and Road exists. What is it showing you so far? It's showing you a continuity of strategic concerns. So what else happens in 2012? One of the most important scholars to President Hu, a scholar named, advisors to President Hu, a scholar named Wang Jisi, who's at Beijing University, writes an article that appears in the Global Times, an important publication, with a nationalist bent, called Marching Westward. And he says in that article that China needs to essentially recognize that to the east, it faces US allies, US partners, possible conflicts in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, lots and lots of complicated political situations. But, and this is a direct quote, unlike East Asia, there is no US-led regional military alliance among the countries to the west, and there is no possibility that one will arise. In other words, if you look to the west and overland, things look a lot better. So what do we combine in this essay? We combine two things: a concern over the security of China's maritime resource flows with a belief that in some ways they can also circumvent that with continental investments. Not a uniquely Chinese idea. If you go back to your history, Dale in the audience has written about this as well, probably will appreciate this example. The Anglo-German rivalry. The Germans were very concerned before World War I that the British would cut off German trade. So one of the things they tried to do is build a rail line that would go all the way from Berlin to Baghdad and allow them to basically circumvent the British naval advantage. So the idea that geography can be used this way is not new. So in 2013, finally, the Belt and Road is announced. Those are the speeches I mentioned earlier in Kazakhstan and in Indonesia, where President Xi sort of announces both the continental and the maritime components of this initiative. And in 2014, President Xi talks about putting financial institutions in China in service of the Belt and Road. He also eventually puts the Belt and Road into the party charter. Sorry, I said the Constitution earlier, I meant the party charter. And he links it to the concept of the community of common destiny, which is an important concept that China uses to help organize its vision of how Asia should look. What's also important about that speech is that President Xi explicitly links the Belt and Road to a concept called national rejuvenation. This is a concept that is not new, but we've heard President Xi talk a lot about it. And for those of you who may not know Chinese history, the idea is that from the Opium Wars of the 19th century to the founding of the Communist Party, there was a 100-year period where China was sort of pushed down by imperial powers and prevented from being the prosperous economy and the successful political and military power that it was supposed to be. And that continues through supposedly 1949. And rejuvenation is the idea of China reclaiming its rightful place. And that idea has been with Chinese nationalists for about 100 years. And so when President Xi linked Belt and Road to rejuvenation, he was elevating the political importance of Belt and Road in Chinese strategy. The idea was no longer that Belt and Road was just about economics. It was actually about making China be the power it was always destined to be. And that is a linkage that has endured to this day, despite all the problems that Belt and Road has faced. So what does this mean in concrete terms for Belt and Road investments? Well, let's look at some of the most important. Some of the most important are in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, in Bangladesh. There's a space project in Argentina, which is actually useful for the Chinese military to engage in space operations. Heavy investments in the Maldives, the Haifa port in Israel. All of these places matter tremendously for the Indian Ocean and its control and its access, et cetera, right? They're all strategically relevant locations. So that is the history of the Belt and Road. That's the first thing kind of that I want to talk about, and the strategic continuity that runs through it. The second thing that's worth mentioning is its failures. Because as ambitious as this project is, it's really hard to do development finance no matter what. Even if you're a rich country with rule of law and the best possible companies that work efficiently, development finance is challenging. Infrastructure investment is challenging. And China has learned that as well. There's been a massive expansion, but it's really brought three major problems that countries across Asia, particularly where Belt and Road started, but also around the world, are increasingly noticing and concerned about. Some of the concerns are political. Right? That's the first category. Countries are upset about Chinese bribery. They're upset about political interference sometimes, and they believe that some projects will benefit politicians and not the broader public. So there's a concern that the people are not getting the deal that they deserve. So that's the political concern. The second is a security-related concern. That if it's the case that China thinks about some of these projects from a security-minded perspective, then isn't it the case that some of the investments might create vulnerabilities for these countries or strategic dependence on China? That's the second set of concerns. And you can think about Sri Lanka and its concerns about hosting a potential Chinese military base when India is its next door neighbor, right? That's an untenable situation for Sri Lanka. And the third set of concerns are economic. Some countries doubt that they can pay back the loans, or they're frustrated about procurement requirements that advantage laborers from China or companies from China. And the idea here is that people don't feel like the economic benefits are flowing directly to them in the way that they would like. So because of these concerns, we saw a backlash to the Belt and Road. We saw Myanmar freeze work on dam projects. We saw it scale back works on a port project. Since 2015, we've seen Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Myanmar, and Pakistan, all some of the leading places for the Belt and Road, ask for changes in Belt and Road terms, and often this was produced by a few things, either a change in domestic government, so a new coalition comes to power, rising nationalism, concern over sovereignty erosion, and just general distrust of what China's intentions might be. And so in particular, in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and Malaysia, you actually saw candidates campaign in part on their concerns about Belt and Road projects, and to some small degree, perhaps you could even say Pakistan as well, under the new government of Imran Khan. Outside of Asia, though, there's a lot of Belt and Road projects too. They're not always described as Belt and Road. But also these projects have raised concerns in places like Mexico, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Equatorial Guinea. Did I mention Ecuador? Ecuador is another great example of this. So these are the problems, right, that Belt and Road has. That's the second thing I wanted to mention, that there is a backlash in parts of the world. The third thing I wanted to mention was that despite that backlash, the Belt and Road proves surprisingly resilient. And specifically, China has a variety of advantages that no other country can easily match, which is why it remains so able to push these projects forward despite the concerns that I just laid out. China has resources. It has technical know-how. It doesn't really have governance requirements for loans. It has few real competitors in that financing space that can move as quickly as China can. So in many cases, these have proved decisive in countries choosing to go with Chinese loans. At the same time, there's also very few competitors in financing that are able to as nimbly adjust their terms. And China has indeed adjusted its terms when countries complained about them. Generally, though, it's only adjusted terms for countries that it thought were strategically important or politically important. And if you're not strategically relevant or particularly politically important, then you don't get as good a deal. And I can speak to that in detail if there's any interest. So basically, let's talk about resilience. I gave you a long list of countries that had problems. Let me talk about how each and every one of those countries came back to China. Indonesia and Thailand had high-speed rail projects. They postponed them, then they restarted them. Bangladesh switched from China to Japan in 2016 for its first deep-water port. And then, for its second deep-water port, it went back to China. Nepal was building 2 hydroelectric dams with Chinese assistance. A new government came in and said nope. And then another government came in and said yes. And that new government also decided to push forward a rail project that would go under the Himalayan mountains, which would actually, for the first time ever, connect the Indian subcontinent directly to China in a kind of effective and efficient way. It's never really been done, but that's what Nepal wants to accomplish. India's terrified because that same rail line could be used to push military personnel into the subcontinent, again, in a way that historically has been complicated to do. If you wanted to conquer India, the best way historically was either coming through Afghanistan or doing it by sea. Doing it by sea ended up being more enduring. The case of Myanmar. Myanmar canceled the dam project, it scaled back a port project, it scaled back the pipeline project. The pipelines went forward. The dams are still under consideration. And the port project is now going forward too, although it's been slimmed down. Again, a sign of China's ability to adapt. But my favorite and perhaps the most important cases are Sri Lanka and Malaysia. And they really tell you everything you need to know. Sri Lanka gave China a 99-year lease on its Hambantota port after proving unable to meet a $1.4 billion amount in payments that it owed China. It couldn't pay the interest, and it had a big budget problem. But what did it? So it gave up the port to China, and the debt was forgiven. So you'd think they learned their lesson, right? But just a few months later, in February of this year, Sri Lanka went back to China for $1 billion of loans in highway construction. So now, once again, they owe China $1 billion. But they couldn't pay it last time. They probably can't pay it in the future. In Malaysia, this is the most interesting case to me. You had massive amounts of projects pushed by the Chinese government with the enthusiastic welcoming of the Malaysian government. In part, it seems, because there was some paybacks given to Malaysian government officials. There was evidence of corruption. Mahathir, the leader of Malaysia now, came into power campaigning in part against this. And there is a history in Malaysia of anti-Chinese racism, which he also tapped into. There's also a concern about the economic project. And Mahathir is a unique individual because he claims a great degree of legitimacy in Asia as a truth teller to the great powers. He would criticize the United States all the time, and during the Asian financial crisis, he stood up to the United States as well. And so he has a lot of legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese and in the eyes of others in the region. So when Mahathir criticized China on the Belt and Road, they took notice. And they changed their terms, and they cut the price of one railway by a third to make sure he was okay. And once he was on board, they moved forward. So again, having some political cachet and some security relevance seems to get you a better deal. And that's basically the story of the resilience of the Belt and Road, and we can see that going forward globally. The final thing I'll talk about then is adaptation. Because the Belt and Road hasn't stood still as these obstacles have arisen. It has, in fact, evolved. Maybe not as fast as it should have, and there are certainly limits to how well it can evolve, but it's evolved nonetheless. So in 2018, we had a speech by President Xi. It was the 5th anniversary of the Belt and Road announcement, right? It was announced in 2013, 2018 is the 5th anniversary. And what does he do? Well, he announces a few things. And many of these things, by the way, were announced again at the Belt and Road Forum, the second one that was held just last year. The reason I mentioned that they were reiterated is because he had to say it twice because it didn't get done within the first year, right? This is still an ongoing agenda for them that they're pushing. One of the things is basically to go from what he called, President Xi, the broad brushstrokes, which are the big infrastructure projects, to what he called the fine brushstrokes, smaller projects that are more manageable and less likely to provoke backlash, more likely to be popular. That's point one. Point two, President Xi talked about publicity. China was losing an informational contest over the Belt and Road. All these media companies were saying the Belt and Road was bad. And China needed its own media companies to say the Belt and Road is good. And it needed to work with local journalists to make it happen. Now, it happens to be that journalism is beleaguered in the United States. It happens to be that if you're beleaguered in the United States, you're probably even more beleaguered around the world, right? The financial model of journalism is under threat. That's an opportunity. If you're an authoritarian state with a lot of money, you can actually kind of buy influence in media at the lowest price ever, at a bargain price. And indeed, we've seen a lot of Belt and Road media cooperation agreements, sometimes exchange programs bringing local journalists in Belt and Road countries directly to China for 7 months. I've interviewed people who have gone through these programs. The point is to put a positive media face on the Belt and Road. And after all, if you control the information space, does it really matter? The Belt and Road is a disaster? Who's going to know? So that's part of the idea here. It's a very important. We have a project at Brookings on the subject of China's information influence efforts around the world. And I didn't want to do the project when I was first given the task. We had some people who were saying, this is a good idea, you should do it. And I said, I don't really want to do it. The more I did it, the more I realized it's central to a lot of the economic and political competition. In addition to that second point on media, the third point is greater supervision. President Xi wants greater supervision at the party and the state level. There's been more party supervision that he's invested in. At the state level, there's been a new institution that was launched to coordinate some of the other institutions to make sure that Belt and Road doesn't harm China's image. Fourth, they've canceled projects. Some projects were a millstone around China's neck, like the East Africa Railway project. It was just such a hard thing for them to push forward. So they canceled stuff like that because they realized it's going to make them look bad in the future. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, there's a belief that the Belt and Road must continue. And I'll end with a quote by President Xi in that 5th year anniversary speech. He said, quote, "The world today is undergoing a period of great development, great change, and great adjustment. And China must have a strategic vision, establish a global vision, keep a sense of what is unexpected and what is possible, have a sense of history," and here's the important part, "and we must work hard to seize the opportunity of this big change in the international system that has not appeared for 100 years, right?" There's a belief in China that the Belt and Road is part of this larger effort to shape the rules, the norms, the politics of the globe in a post-American world, in a world where the United States refuses to or is unable to meet its global commitments. And that is the final point I have about how the Belt and Road fits into grand strategy, and where I'll end, that as we imagine American politics after President Trump, as we imagine Western politics after Brexit, there is a belief that there is an opportunity for China to write the rules, and that this is one of the most important vehicles to do it. So they will make changes, they will adjust it, but the Belt and Road is here to stay. It's resilient despite all of its challenges, probably reshape the politics of Asia and maybe even politics of the world in the next 5 to 10 years.